In this episode, we replay a webinar from Kona AI on current trends and innovation in data-driven compliance.
There we go. Hi, everybody. My name is Vincent Walden. We're going to be joining, or we'll be starting in about 1 or 2 minutes. We just want to welcome everybody. I see the attendees are now coming online. And just give us another minute, actually probably 2 minutes, because there might be some latecomers to join, and then we'll get started. So sit tight for just a minute. I got my coffee, although my background makes it disappear. So I'm going to type it. Welcome, everyone. We will get started. Funny, Tom, you do these more than I do. So usually give them an extra minute or so before we get started, huh?
Right.
Okay, I see the attendee list is still just growing a little bit consistently. I'll wait for it to level out and we'll get started in about 30 seconds or so. So appreciate everybody waiting, and we'll get started here very soon. A lot of cool stuff to talk about today. I can't wait to get into it. And all right, I think I'm showing about a minute after. So why don't we we'll call it here, and others join, they will. And again, this will be a recorded session. So we will be able to make this link available for anybody who has registered or who cannot see it. So with that, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for giving us your time for this hour. It might be a little bit less than an hour, but we'll be around there. My name is Vincent Walden. I'm CEO of Kona AI. We're a leading compliance and anti-corruption, anti-fraud monitoring platform used typically by mid to large corporations with global risks around anti-corruption, sanctions and trade compliance, anti-fraud, and the like. With me is Rain Towns, Global Head Risk and Compliance Monitoring for Nokia. Welcome, Rain. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
also,
for having me.
yeah, and also Tom Fox, who many of you know as the voice of compliance. Tom, welcome, and thanks for joining.
Thanks, Vince. Really happy to be here with you and Rain.
Yeah. So first, for the audience, let's go into just a little bit of backgrounds. Again, Tom, you taught me this when I did my podcast shows for you. People want to know a little bit about the individual. So again, I'll go first. I'll be moderating this panel discussion with Rain and Tom. I'm, again, as mentioned, I'm CEO of Kona AI. Prior to, and kind of how we came about, prior to Kona running a software company, I was a consulting partner in the Big Four for over a decade, and kind of grew up during the Big Four doing white collar investigations, e-discovery, and fraud and anti-corruption matters. And a lot of the things that we did, and a lot of the, building those libraries of tests and learning a lot of the manual data analytics techniques that were done, really could be over time learned could be automated, and that's what a lot of what we've built with Kona is a lot of that automation to make the review of high risk or improper payments and transactions faster and more automated. And for that, I do a lot of work for the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and I write for Fraud Magazine. Last year, they awarded me the CFE of the year, which was a big deal because it was also coincidentally the year that I started the company. And or took over as CEO. and that really helped accelerate our growth. So that's a little bit about me. Rain, can you tell the audience a little bit about your role at Nokia?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rain Towns, I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been with Nokia for about 6 years. So my role is global head of ethics and compliance risk and monitoring. And so I have a team that's responsible for several different areas. Data analytics definitely rolls up into my team, as does risk assessments in the ENC space. Before I joined Nokia, I worked for General Electric, and I was a compliance leader in the power franchise. And before that, I worked for a couple of other companies, also in various compliance roles. So I've been doing this for a while. This is a really exciting time for me because the push to use data to drive compliance programs up a level, it's just a really exciting time to be involved in compliance. So I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Awesome. Now, and for the man who needs no introduction, Tom Fox, over to you.
Thanks, Vince. I'm Tom Fox. I've been in the compliance arena for about 15 years. Currently, the founder of the Compliance Podcast Network. I've written 28 books on compliance, business ethics, and leadership. And I will just shout out two because they are my two best sellers. They're both children's books. Number one, being a compliance officer is awesome. Number two, speaking up is awesome. So if you need a quick, easy, illustrated way to explain what you do to your children, your CEO, or the rest of your company, buy one of those books.
In children's books. I love it. That's great. All right. And it looks like we've got a pretty good attendance joining now. And so I think we'll dive right in. Tom, let me start with you first. We named the session Data-Driven Compliance and Leading Trends and Innovations. When you think about data-driven compliance, and I know you say that a lot, and you've inspired me to say it a lot, what does that phrase kind of mean to you, and how do companies demonstrate data-driven compliance?
So, Vince, data-driven compliance is one more in the evolution of the compliance profession, one more step. When you certainly when I started, and probably when you started as well, it was very much legal-driven, by lawyers for lawyers, and over time, I began to see that properly seen compliance is a business process, and that as a business process, it can be measured, it can be studied, it can be monitored, and it can be improved based upon that information. You were on a different journey through your work at EY, and you were one of the first people who were really talking about data analytics publicly, and sort of like-minded spirits found each other. And so we started sort of thinking about how can we move this more to the mainstream. In 2016, the Department of Justice, actually, Securities and Exchange Commission, for the first time called out data analytics in a enforcement action. And that was the key energy enforcement action, where they suggested data analytics would have shown or demonstrated a range of values that were outside the norm for certain gift, travel, and entertainment for the company. So the regulators' thinking evolved as well. And as we have moved in this evolution really together, data analytics has become a critical element to improve the business process of compliance. Now, this does not mean that data is going to take over, or data is even number one, because you have to have the human element. You have to have someone who can interpret the data and then use that data going forward. But I really advocate properly seeing compliance as a business process, and data-driven compliance allows you to do the things that I mentioned a little bit earlier. It allows you to measure it. It allows you to monitor it. It allows you to improve it all in a documented fashion, so that if a regulator ever comes knocking, you can demonstrate to them not only the effectiveness of your compliance program, but how you are moving it forward.
Awesome. And, I love that compliance is a business process. It's not a start and stop type thing. Rain, what's your thoughts? And again, in the companies that you've worked with and leading companies like Nokia and GE and others. So what's your thoughts? What comes to mind when you think about data-driven compliance?
Well, I see it as, another table leg, right? So you have training and you've got processes in place for things like pre-approvals and mandatory reviews for due diligence and the like. But where I see data coming in is trying to tie those together to making sure that it's all working like you think it is. So I wish I could say every one of our processes is absolutely automated, but we would like to get there. But that's not where we are right now. So our compliance program and controls do include some manual touches, and data is the way that we are checking to make sure that there's not a lot of gaps there. And if there are, right, that either makes a case for budget, to get them automated, or it drives more accountability and drives information, actionable information on where we need to do more training. So I just see it as another way to shore up the compliance program and the effectiveness of the compliance program as an initial start. I mean, I think there's more to come, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, so I don't want to jump ahead. But that's where we're really looking at it a lot right now today.
Yeah, and agree. And don't worry, for the audience, we're going to dive into exactly what do we mean by data analytics and what elements, what should we be measuring and what should we be looking at, but we'll get to that in a minute. I'd like to maybe kind of on that same theme, Rain, what are some, can you give us a couple of success stories or examples that stick out in your mind of companies that you've seen that primarily did it well or had some good recoveries or good or credit given? What comes to mind?
Yeah, well, so we've been using it. I mean, I think probably, almost everybody, in this webinar we're already using data, right? It's not like we just started using data in 2016. I think the challenge is using data more effectively and using more complex groupings of data to trigger, actionable deliverables that we can look at more closely. So, some of it, we've been using at Nokia, we've been using data for a very long time to do monitoring work, to make sure that our control points and our processes are being followed out in the field. Where we really want to move is to be more, a lot of people, I'm sure we're all doing the historical snapshot in time, right? So here are all of our commercial third parties. Let's check to make sure that they've all gone through due diligence. Do we have any gaps? Then let's close them and figure out why the process didn't work if we do have gaps. And so then we've moved to real-time monitoring, which is where we're really spending a lot of time now. So we're actually getting data in and we're doing real-time comparisons to make sure that we're catching things as early as possible in the process, so that we can be ahead of the curve and we can avoid any misses. We can avoid doing business with a company that maybe for reputational reasons, we don't want to do business with them. So the real-time monitoring is helping us make sure our controls are working and our gaps are closing. And I think where we really want to go, where we're trying to go, is more complex analytical models where we can be more predictive, to see around the corner, to see what we don't know. But successes have been, we've got a lot of successes in our monitoring programs, and we typically add another 3 or 4 a year is what we've been, where we've been kind of going. And it's things like, making sure all of our hospitality is getting pre-approved. Monitoring to make sure that that the expenses around hospitality have the right data and the right receipts and records that support them. We're also using it to make sure that in transactional monitoring from Salesforce, that all of our commercial third parties are being identified, that they're all being run through due diligence, including transactions. We actually review higher risk transactions as well. And making sure that within CRM, so it's a manual process when the sales leader is putting in information, that they're accurately reflecting the type of transaction it is based upon the commercial parties that are involved. So, those are success stories that we've had recently. There are more, but it's really interesting what you can learn once you put data to work for you.
Yeah. And, that holy grail of being able to identify and flag and stop a payment, a potentially improper payment before it's paid. And you mentioned that real-time concept, and you don't necessarily have to be almost real-time. You have to be within 30 days time or whatever your payment terms are. And so, for example, if you pay your vendors on net 30 or net 60 days, then you got 60 days to stop the payment. And it's kind of an interesting kind of balance between that time period that you have. But being able to stop an improper payment is kind of one of the key success, either through predictive models or through the algorithms that you run through. And I think you guys are doing some really innovative stuff there. Tom, you've seen and interviewed scores, if not hundreds, of companies and talked to them about their compliance programs. Which companies stick out among your mind, or you don't have to name names per se, but what are some of the leading examples that you see?
Well, unlike before the HUAC committee, I will name names
Yeah.
because they're in the public record, and I think these companies should be acknowledged for what they've done as industry leaders in compliance and in data analytics. And I'm going to start with AB InBev and their brew right program, and they've been very open about and very transparent to the compliance community about why they created the program, but more importantly, how that program evolved inside the company. And if I could pick up a point you raised, Vince, just a moment ago, they really moved from detect to prevent. And the cost savings in moving from detect an improper payment to preventing an improper payment are not just the cost savings of that payment. It's all the associated costs with having to go back and get the payment, potential legal costs, potential reputational issues, potential bad will, stakeholder issues. So when you can move from a detect to a prevent, that's where your savings go up exponentially. And AB InBev has been, as I said, very open, made several presentations over the years on their program. But the second one I'd like to call out specifically happened a couple of weeks ago, at least I found out about it, and that's Albemarle, who had a major FCPA enforcement action. But the Department of Justice, in resolving the case through a non-prosecution agreement, or NPA, specifically called out the company's use of data analytics in their remediation efforts to overcome the events and issues which led to the original FCPA matter. And this was the first time I recall a company being called out in a settlement document or a resolution document for their data analytics program. And so I think this was very significant. The DOJ is clearly sending a message. First of all, I'm going to give another shout out to Albemarle for doing this. So kudos to them, their CCO, and their program. But equally important for everyone on this webinar, Vince, is the specific acknowledgement by the Department of Justice. The DOJ always telegraphs what's important to them. And starting in 2020, with the 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, they said the CCO must have access to all data across an organization. No, you may have data silos, but a CCO has to be able to punch through all of those data silos. So to me, it's a natural progression from 2020 to this Albemarle FCPA enforcement action, where the DOJ specifically stated, not just clearly said, specifically stated their data analytics program allowed them to move forward with the remediation. And I think the critical part, Vince, is that they were not required to have a monitor. To not have a monitor requires two things. One, an effective compliance program, but two, testing of it. And the DOJ has made very clear those requirements. And here, obviously, Albemarle has an effective compliance program, but more importantly, they've monitored it and tested it through their data analytics program. And the power of that saved the company millions, and it tells the rest of us what the DOJ is going to be looking for in a compliance program going forward.
Wow. Yeah. Well, those two companies that you gave are near and dear to my heart, as you mentioned as well. That's great. On that topic of kind of regulatory environment, was it last week or the week before? Time's a blur, but Lisa Monaco's statement around the new safe harbor provisions around M&A. Historically, everybody was using the Halliburton benchmark, which I think is probably a decade old, of 90 days, which was kind of tight, but it wasn't really firm. But the DOJ announced I think it was last week, that they were going to allow six months kind of safe harbor of an acquisition target to raise to the DOJ to help incentivize voluntary disclosure. Tom, what do you think the impacts of that are, and how it relates to kind of analytics, or at least the ability to quickly assess your new company that you've bought and raise any red flags?
Sure. So you referenced the Halliburton opinion release. Well, Vince, it was actually 15 years ago
Good God.
because it was
Time
0802.
flies.
So that means it
Wow.
came out in 2008. And that's been the guidepost literally since that time. What Lisa Monaco gave all of us, the compliance community, but the broader U.S. corporate community, was a clear, dated, safe harbor. No more questions. If I do this, will I get? No, if I do this, I will get. And that's in the M&A realm. And you're right, 6 months. In my corporate experience, 6 months is about the blink of an eye. We used to say at one of the companies I worked at, you couldn't move your office across the hall in less than 6 months, just because it was such a big company. And so 6 months is incredibly quick, particularly in the context of an acquisition of any size. So you need to have a data analytics complement and a capability to meet that 6 months. Now, I would hope that a compliance function is a part of a pre-acquisition due diligence team who has access to the data room. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Even if you do have access, everyone on this call knows, one, you never have enough time, and two, you never have enough information, ever.
Certainly, certainly pre-due diligence, you don't get access to the books and records.
Right. So the more you can do pre-acquisition, the better off you're going to be. But if you don't have data analytics and you have a 6-month deadline to do the investigation, not just into high-risk agents, as in the Halliburton opinion release, but to all agents, and uncover any FCPA violations, write that up and report it to the DOJ, that's an incredibly aggressive time frame. And then you have a 1-year time frame to fully remediate. So you're on the clock. And data analytics is really the only way you're going to be able to do that effectively and efficiently and show the department. But the benefits to you are a presumption of a declination, meaning that's what right out of the batter's box, the DOJ's offer is going to be a declination. Now, there can be aggravating factors, and Dag Monaco made that clear, but this is really good news for the compliance community, for the M&A community, and the broader corporate community as well, Vince.
Love it. Rain, do you have any comments on kind of the DOJ and how that's going to impact you? 6 months enough time, too little time?
Well, you're never going to hear anybody say 6 months is enough time, right? But it's a lot better. It's a lot more realistic, and it's a more realistic picture of what companies that are acquiring other companies are going through. I mean, one of the things that also the 6 months gives us more time to do is to drive our culture of integrity, right, to acquired businesses. We don't know necessarily how strong their culture is, and any company that's acquiring another one wants to ensure that there's that strong culture there, the open reporting culture, the no retaliation. And 6 months gives a more reasonable time period to drive all of that messaging, to acquired companies.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Because we can't forget that data analytics is fantastic, right? But we can't ever underestimate the value of the people who are reporting concerns, that are actually seeing them firsthand.
Yep.
That is something that we have to continue to focus on.
Amen. Can't take the human element out of it. It just is helping to drive decisions. In fact, let me switch gears now to the actual data sources. And this is where we're going to drive into what we mean by data analytics too. Now, I always say, start with the risk assessment, or you can even use analytics for the risk assessment. But so when I talk to a lot of companies, they say, oh, we want to use AI, or we want to use machine learning. We want to use chatbots. And, my response is, to do what? There is not just to go do analytics just to say that you're doing analytics. If it's not helping solve a problem, make a decision faster, or manage risk around third parties, or around people or employees, or around, what have you. If you don't define your risk assessment, that's where you start with your analytics program, is your risk assessment, at least in my view. And then you map those risks to, what are the data elements that gives us transparency into those risks. Sometimes it's cyber, sometimes it's privacy, sometimes it's anti-corruption, so it's bribery and corruption, sometimes it's sanctions and trade compliance. It depends on the industry and the business. So really, my message to the audience is, start with your risk assessment. Rain, when you think about data analytics and where you start, or what kind of risks do you think about? And again, not to go into any detail around any, in your world, but how do you map that exercise to what data sources are you particularly most interested in for running analytics?
So we've had a really robust risk assessment process within ethics and compliance for a while now. We use a lot of data that feeds into that, and we're fortunate that we have direct access to a lot of data, and it's data from finance and internal audit and from HR and various sources, which is great, and that all feeds into our risk assessment process. Where we want to move that is to take outside of the quantitative data, to take the things that you can't really put a number on, right? And so a lot of that is sources from external sources about all the geopolitical issues we're having now. Not only the DOJ resolutions, which is Tom so well articulated, that really kind of demonstrate where we need to be looking and where we need to be going, but also from other things such as government agencies. I mean, you look at all of the material that has been put out into the public regarding the evasion of Russian sanctions, right? We all need to be looking at that. And that needs to be informing us as well of where our risks might be. That might not be from a number, a metric, from a specific data source. But once we get all that and we look at our risks, then that does inform us on where do we want to do more monitoring? Where do we need to use data to be more effective? And one way that we'll do that is with, we'll use data to trigger training at just the right time that a person might need training. And we have several examples, and we're continuing to expand this and using more complicated combinations of data. But one really simple one that we put into place really quickly is, when an employee is going off to a trade association, so they're going to be engaging socially with competitors, we want them to remember what the rules are around what you can and cannot talk with competitors about, right? So, when that pre-approval for that trip for that reason, hits concur, then we immediately send out this very short module. And so that's just like one example, but looking at data and attaching it to your risk assessment based upon, what countries are you moving into, where are sales growing that are high risk countries. That also from external information, that there is, political unrest or other issues that might drive certain behaviors that would not be acceptable, then that's where you kind of figure out, okay, that's where I need to focus. And then you try to determine which data points you need in order to drive some effective triggers for actioning. And hopefully, at least in real time, predictive is ideally where we want to go, but at least in real time now.
Yeah. And when I think of risks, there are only, this is kind of a simplified version, but there's only 3 entities that can rip you off. There are vendors, there are employees, and there are customers. Now, of course, there, you can think about government and society and everything, but if you think about what data sources you have at your fingertips and disposals, I'm going to put cyber away from on the side because there's always external hackers, but there's really only 3 entities. There's vendors, customers, and employees. And when I say customers, that also includes distributors or, third parties that you work with that are, JV partners, et cetera, in that category. But it sounds kind of strange, but yeah, those are the only 3. And if you could set up controls around those 3 types of entities, well, then you've got very good transparency into your program. Tom, what do you think when you think about some of the more relevant data sources or most common data sources that people use in their analytics program? What comes to mind in your experience?
Well, let me pick up on a point Rain raised and maybe expand on it a little bit. And she, of course, mentioned the Russian sanctions that came about as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That opened up an entire new level of risk. But what I'd like to do, Vince, is try to explain it as a business process. Yes, there is export control risk, but guess what? What are you going to do if your primary source for raw materials was Russia, or a sanctioned entity, or you're doing business with a Russian oligarch for raw materials, for materials to bring to the United States to help you build or create a product? Well, that's not a legal risk solely. That's a business risk. And how are you going to find alternative sourcing? Obviously, the pandemic taught us alternative sourcing is much more important than previously thought. Well, now let me flip that to the potential coming conflict with China. What are you going to do about the risk of China? Are we going to have a same or similar number of sanctioned entities within China? We already have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which prevents companies from purchasing goods from the Xinjiang region without evidence that it wasn't produced with forced labor. What are you going to do if your 30% of your customer market is in China? How are you going to replace that? So you can use those types of data analytics, both on the supply side and the sales side. Now, if we weren't talking to a compliance group, Vince, people might say, well, that's just good business planning, Tom. That's what risk management is. But we're in a compliance group, so we're going to talk about the compliance requirements around those. But that's why I see compliance as a business process. And when you can wed those two through data analytics, it can make your company more nimble, more able to adjust more quickly, and frankly, a better business.
Wow. Any comments on that, Rain, you want to add before we move to the next
Oh,
topic?
I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap, with compliance and other business functions. And, we partner very tightly with our sales teams, and our procurement teams. And, we're all walking hand in hand. And while we all have various, scopes that differ, we all have that overlap. And if we weren't so tightly bound, I think our compliance program would not be as effective as it is.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think that's if that's missing in a compliance program, I don't think the compliance program can be as effective as it should be.
Yeah, and I'll share a personal story or experience that I saw with a company I was working with back in my consulting days. Actually, I call it not being invited to the party, and it was so frustrating because procurement and IT and business finance, I think even internal audit, they all got together and were putting in a new third-party transaction monitoring system. They were installing Coupa and contract compliance and review. And, yes, it was an IT initiative and a procurement initiative, but first off, compliance didn't know that was happening. And I was helping them kind of help do a data-driven compliance program. And we found out just through some of the interviews that this initiative was going on. And I'm like, hey, has anybody ever thought to think on your third-party questionnaire that you might want to ask some, risk, some anti-corruption or type language? They were just doing risks around, how stable is the company and what's the third party's credit score? And again, those are all good procurement questions, but not risk or, not anti-corruption or prevention and detection type questions. And it was a big kind of aha that like, wait, compliance they didn't even think to include a compliance in that. And that was I don't want to say culture issue, but maybe it was, but don't let that happen. And then, that's when I coined that term. Hey, you got to be invited to the party. Take your, for compliance professionals, if you're not taking the IT folks out to lunch or to, or interacting with other leaders in the company, that's dangerous. And again, most of the leading compliance programs I've seen, and I remember back in the days, in the AB InBev days, when I was a consultant helping them build their Brew Right program, I saw Matt Galvin taking everybody. He would travel the world meeting with leaders from all over the businesses all the time. And he would just listen. What are you seeing? How are things going? What issues are you seeing? And he would just listen, but he was always very visible. And I'd say invited to the parties. And so that's my little soapbox. So for you.
But that raises a really good point too, because every team is doing different things in the field with third parties, whatever, customers, commercial third parties, vendors. And we need to leverage that. So, we have a very robust ESG program. And within that program, there's a really robust supplier review process, and we're leveraging that. So, whereas it's a perfect opportunity for compliance to spread out its scope of coverage a little bit more if we're leveraging what the ESG team is already doing. Same thing for trade management. We work closely with trade management. They're doing a lot of work. We are too. So we're in sync. Partnering with internal audit, that's another one where compliance can, have a bit larger scope, leveraging work that's already being done by another team.
Yeah.
And but you have to have those connections to do that, right? It doesn't happen.
You got to
in a
just know.
vacuum.
Exactly. And then on that ESG party example, there are scores of great compliance tests that can help in that program.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're monitoring vendor payments, how much fuel spend have you gone? Or look at, how much in, in travel or fuel, in things that emit carbon, whether it's fuel purchases or other types of accounts that you can look at to quantify those types of issues, or how much, good, not good, how much charitable things or how much, ESG initiatives have you spent? And, when you're doing an effective compliance program and monitoring transactions, you can actually provide those data points to the ESG stakeholders, and so there's all sorts of things that, compliance can have can add value to those types of groups. Tom, before we move to the next topic, which is innovation, do you have any closing thoughts on applications or data sources?
It's just that compliance has to have access to those data sources now. That's the DOJ requirement. And if you find yourself with a regulator knocking and your answer is, well, I didn't have access to that, that's not going to be acceptable. So the DOJ has really brought the hammer down, and I hope compliance officers are using that in their discussions with their colleagues. Yeah,
no, good point. All right, well, the fun part, well, this has all been fun, but the part I'm super passionate about is on innovation. The huge buzz, well, and again, it's always a buzz, and there's always going to be something new. 10 years ago, it was big data. Oh my God. And then it was machine learning. Oh my God, everybody got to have machine learning. Now it's generative AI. And what's this ChatGPT? I guarantee 2 to 3 years from now, there'll be something else. And if anybody knows from any of the tech companies on what that is, call me, because I want to be prepared for it. But there's always a buzz. And it always makes it exciting. And the technology professionals and the software companies, the big software companies, they always make sure something's in the pipe. But this generative AI and AI is pretty interesting and practical. And I'm going to show an example of it in a minute. But when I think about innovations, or when you think about innovations around generative AI, Tom, what are you seeing kind of are the more interesting applications, or what have people been talking about in your compliance circles that you talk to about ChatGPT or generative AI?
So Vince, I don't want to sound pedestrian, but in many ways, compliance professionals are still asking questions like, great, I have access. What does it mean? Can you give me a chart? Can you visualize the data you have just run for me so that I can figure out how to use it? Because remember, you may be dealing with a lawyer. We all know what that means. So in many ways, it's still visualization. It's still, how can I use this? But let me pick up on a couple of points you raised earlier, because it really struck me. And that is in your accounts payable for your vendors. And then some compliance issues around gifts, travel, and entertainment, marketing spend, charitable donations. Why can't you run it 15 days, every invoice that's come in, to see if there are anomalies? You don't have to specify a specific amount that Tom Fox has billed at $5,000. But if Tom Fox has billed $1,000 to your company over the past 12 to 18 months, and an invoice comes in for $5,000, let's look at the backup documentation to see that, because that's an anomaly. It's outside the standard range. And I really hadn't thought about 30-day payment terms, but that's absolutely brilliant. Run it at 15 days, run it at 20 days, and just see, are there anomalies? And it doesn't mean something's wrong, but it may mean you need to look at the backup documentation. And it may mean a further investigation, like a phone call. Hey, Tom, why are you billing $5,000? I can't really see it in your backup documentation. Did you have a big project? Was it something unusual? Something like that. That's a preventative step. That's an accounts payable. But now take that concept over to pre-approve or request for pre-approved GTE. If you are bringing people to the United States or paying for travel, what's the cost? Is it out of line with what you've seen? And the same with charitable donations. Have you made an anomalous, meaning outside and standard A to Z range for charitable payments? Every corporation has a charitable donation group. They don't make payments without, at least I hope they don't, without a written submission of who the charity is, what the payment amount is, and what it's for. Well, with data analytics, you can run those once again every 15 days, every 20 days, so that you move from preventative to, from detecting to preventative. And that's really some of the basic power I see right now. If let me go back to AB InBev with their machine learning. Matt Galvin was very clear that he and his team used machine learning to improve the brewer right system, but it improved the compliance professionals who are using this. So it was almost a loop of continuous improvement throughout that. So machine learning is critical. The generative AI can run calculations incredibly fast now. If you can secure your data within a defined scope or defined data lake, can be incredibly powerful. But some of it, Vince, is just the basics, literally, that you and I have been talking about for a long time. What does it mean? How do I use it? Can I get it visualized? Can you put it in chart form for me so that I can see it? And more importantly, I can explain it to senior management.
No, I love it. Rain, what are your thoughts on generative AI? What are the buzz from a corporate perspective? What are you seeing or hearing?
Well, it's moving fast, right? So the big buzz is it's moving fast. And, we've got an incredibly talented team that's staying ahead of that. I'm still trying to get my arms around how that can be utilized by a compliance program to make it more effective. And at the same time, right, to make sure that we're, protecting information that we need to protect, and we're doing the right things and getting actionable items through AI that are truly not false positives, right? Because you hear a lot of buzz about, is the information that you're getting through these processes really kind of the source of truth? But I'm going to go back to something that I'm not going to name him, but there was a compliance officer I worked under in my career who always said the answer is always the culture of integrity. The answer is always the culture of integrity. And so what I really am excited about, whether it's AI, or if it's some other way that we can be more predictive using creative use of bringing together various data streams, is to determine in my organization where there might be pockets where the culture of integrity is not as strong as we need it to be. What data points can we bring together? And it's going to be a lot of HR, employee surveys, attrition, concerns raised of more of an HR nature rather than a true compliance nature. What other data can we bring in, and how can we combine all of that and use it in a predictive way so that I can identify where there are problems with our culture. And then we can go in there before there are issues, before things may run off the tracks, go in to shore up that culture and make sure that we're preventing problems. I mean, that's where the whole behavioral aspect is really fascinating to me, and I'm sure that AI has a role in that. I'm just not sure how yet, but that's a puzzle that I want to figure out.
And I'll show you. I'm going to show you an example here in a minute. But I love that point of multiple data points. I'm working with a company right now in the global mineral and mining industry. They're integrating over 20 different data sources. So in addition to their SAP transactions, they're pulling in survey data, employee data, performance data, obviously third-party questionnaires and due diligence data. I say bring it all. And again, it's not that you need it all day one. You start with, a data source like the transactions or your survey data or what have you, and then you build onto it. But they've incorporated over 20 different data sources into their risk model that then risk scores the vendors and the third parties that they deal with. And the model has become very efficient. In fact, I want to share my screen real quick and share. This was an article that I published last summer. Many of you guys know the work that the time it was a research project funded by AB InBev that we worked on with MIT. And it was all about profiling and improper payment. And Rain, you helped collaborate on this too. And Tom, you saw this. But the results, I want to share, we looked at almost $75 billion of third-party transactions without mixing any company's data. So no data was blended. Everything was set in their individual, was kept separately, but then the algorithms of what was triggering were built and used for a predictive model. I'm going to share my screen real fast and show you this example. Let's see. Do you guys see my screen, Tom and Ray? Do you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, hold on. Let me make sure I do this right. Hold on. There we go. I gotta push the share button. There we go. Now you should see, do you see the article?
It's very small. There it goes.
Yeah,
that's good.
You see, it was the article was in Fraud Magazine, which was a profile of improper payment. What I want to show the group though is when you took $75 billion, I'm gonna just zoom in on this figure here, of transactions from, I think it was about just over a dozen or so companies. These were the #1 tests that were most common. And this is what we think about as you build that predictive model. Obviously when vendors didn't have a purchase order, or when you hit on a sensitive keyword like, friend fee or special payment. We've all seen some in our investigative years, we've seen some funny ways that no one's going to call it bribe expense, but they are going to come up with kind of interesting ways to describe an improper payment. Now, Tom, you mentioned that statistical anomaly. If I'm billing you $1,000 a month and it jumps to $5,000, that's an anomaly. And so that was a trigger. Monthly recurring payments was also a profile of an improper payment. It was duplicate, having the same amount with a different invoice number, or raised on a weekend or public holiday. It was round dollar, which happened, which is more indicative of cash than not. Or the vendor is missing from the purchase order. It's funny. I just found 2 weeks ago $6 million of payments for a company, and we are analyzing about $2.5 billion of spend for that company. $6 million were paid to the vendor name was cash/miscellaneous. So it was like a one-time vendor type of name. It was just a catch-all which means basically I've skipped the due diligence, but there were over 100 transactions to payments made to the vendor name, cash/miscellaneous. What the heck? If I'm going to steal money from the company, that's the vendor I'm selecting. So this is just an interesting example. The other thing, while I'm sharing my screen, I want to show you an example for the audience of what we mean, an example of generative AI and how it can be used. Again, if it's not making life easier and more intuitive and helping the end user make decisions, then why bother? And here's an example of what the chatbots are coming. This is the future. Again, it's being built now, but I want to show you something that we're working on. And probably Q1 it's going to be coming out. I presented this at the ACFE too, but you'd be shocked at how well pointing a large language model at transactional data can be. Now, and again, here's a typical, this is what a typical viewer dashboard. You see the risk assessment, where transactions are. This is, $800 million of payments, 177,000 invoices across, what is that, 8,500 vendors. And the red is what hit, but show me a chatbot now that instead of clicking, and again, all of us have used Tableau or Power BI to click around. What if I could use a chatbot to do the clicking for me? And hey, the chatbot's identified 3 high-risk transactions based on the risk score and algorithms that it's gone through. What would you like me to do? Well, we want me to show me where those transactions were. And all right, so the bot is telling Power BI to zoom into China. All right. And then now what would you like me to do? See how it's conversational? Again, this is not hard. Now, yes, it's hard to program and we're working on it, but it's not hard for the end user. So now, all right, well, here's, opaque holding. What would you like me to do? Email them to a supervisor? How about we calculate, tell me, what are we looking at here? So it goes into the SQL backend. Oh, it's $5,000. Okay, great. Do you want to now email it, analyze other transactions that are similar? Hey, show me those transactions. It now sends the message to Power BI, pull up the transactions. And again, I can do this with my mouse and clicking, but it's just more fun and easier to have the bot take me to it. And then, all right, now I'm navigating to the payments and now show me those payments and the risk score. Notice, it's hitting on round dollars, it's vendors with only one payment, etc. That's the interaction. And so my prediction is that in the next year, and again, whether it's Kona AI or anything, in the next year, we won't be clicking around dashboards. We will be using generative AI chatbots without having to go to OpenAI. That's key. We're not sending data out. And again, that's a non-starter for everybody. But that kind of technology is the future. We're not going to be clicking dashboards anymore randomly. We're going to be interacting with bots that's going to guide me there. And I think that's kind of the exciting thing, that how generative AI, that's one example of how we can make this kind of easier for our users and drive better decision making. I've got several companies, when they do the analytics, they carve out batches, review sets for their global compliance officers around the world, and they all look at their top 20 or 50 riskiest transactions. You can have the bot make sure it always asks these 10 questions, but then let it go free form after that. So then you can drive consistency in how things are reviewed. So there's all sorts of applications that are coming in the future that's got me excited, that I wanted to share with you guys and the audience on what's to come. Any comments or thoughts before we move on? No? All right, good. Now I did stop sharing my screen, right? We're back?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, making sure. So one of the last things, we've got about 10 minutes, I want to touch on is, budget approvals and getting budget. As you know, we're in October, we're in Q4 2023. People are talking about goals and setting goals and budgets for 2024. My team and I did a little survey, just a little LinkedIn survey, and it was, by no means statistically significant or sound or valid, but we asked several CFOs or people in the finance CFO function, what were the top factors a CFO considers when reviewing budget or technology approvals from chief compliance officers or heads of internal investigations. When you make your pitch or submit your budget approval, what is the CFO thinking? And the responses were, what's most important? What was the number one criteria? Now, granted, the number one risk was legal risks and fines. It was keep your business out of trouble. And it was 39% of the respondents. So that was the number one, which we would expect. But interestingly, both at 28%, fraud prevention and recoveries, which is finding hidden money, was 28%, as well as improved internal controls was another 28%. What was very low was enhanced culture of compliance, 6%. Now, again, don't take this as a major survey or anything, but it was one of those LinkedIn surveys that we did. What that tells me though is, yes, legal risks and fines, the CFO is kind of looking to compliance to say, keep me out of trouble, keep the business out of trouble. Yes. But if you're coming to me with a budget, I also want to see fraud prevention and recoveries, or demonstrate that, as well as make sure we have our internal controls in place, and that we're, that it's solid and relied upon. And by the way, I'm CFO. I'm going to let you compliance worry about that enhanced culture of compliance. I got other things to do. And that's kind of the general thought from that little survey that we did. I'm going to open up any thoughts. Rain, what do you think about when you're making business case justifications to your leadership team or executive committee? What are some of the criteria that they look at?
Well, I think you have to know your audience, right? Because they all approach it differently. So someone from the finance organization, if they're the ones that are holding the pocketbook, someone from the finance organization would definitely be looking at this differently than my chief legal officer. Right. So, I think you have to be flexible in how you market what you want to do. If you need some big numbers to support some technology. And these stakeholders that you've mentioned aren't the only ones that we have to convince. You have to convince the IT department, because when you're talking about complicated data streams and algorithms that the IT department is going to have to figure out how to take information from different platforms and get them all talking to each other. Because flat files are one thing, but flat files of information aren't going to give you anything. Right. So you have to have the IT architecture behind it. And this is where I'm really starting to speak out of my scope. But I know that needs budget. And the IT department, our IT team has to, be sold on what we're doing as well. And the value add is, why is this a priority out of all of the asks that are coming to IT?
Right.
So yeah, so, and depending upon the money, right, there are different levels of how, how much you need to market it and get approvals, but you definitely have to consider who your audience is. And I think you can't go with the same pitch, to every audience.
Yeah. I call it, when I make these companies make that presentation, it's hey, make your business better. And this was an old Big Four saying, but there was the make your business better argument, which is the CFO, finance, and even internal audit, which is the finding hidden money, putting money back on the balance sheet, right? Reduce costs, make the business better. But then there's keep you out of trouble. And so when you're talking to compliance professionals and legal risk, it's to keep you out of trouble, because I don't care how much money we're going to save. If I'm going to end up in jail as a result of this action, we're not doing it. I don't care how much you save money. So that's the keep you out of trouble argument. And finding that balance, you need both, but consider your audience as you described. Tom, any closing thoughts on that?
Vince, what intrigued me is actually all four of these, because certainly the legal risk is number one, but improved internal control, that's my business process argument. And if you can have greater and more effective compliance equating to more efficient internal controls, you're going to have greater ROI. Now, you've talked to us several times about fraud prevention and recoveries, and that's recovery, of monies. So my argument would be, we're going to keep you out of legal risk. We're going to get you money back. We're actually going to make you more money. And we're going to answer what the DOJ says is the most important analysis, which is culture. And we're going to get that from one product or one suite of products, and that's going to be data analytics. So we're going to prevent, we're going to add to the bottom line by fraud recoveries, and we're going to make us more efficient and more profitable by moving to data analytics.
No, I like it. Well, we have about less than 3 or 4 minutes left. Rain, do you have any closing thoughts for the audience?
No, just that it really is, it can be overwhelming, right? The journey to data analytics and the increased use of data in our compliance programs can definitely be overwhelming. And I've had those mornings where I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, because there's so much that can be done that you really have to prioritize. And, the first steps, I think, are the hardest, because that's where you're asking for money for something that's, you could say is untested, right? When you're first starting to walk into more complex data analytics, that really is going to take budget and resource time. So I think you have to think about your problem. What problem do you want to solve? Solving that problem, what is that going to benefit? How is that going to add value to the company? And then you have to determine, what do you need? What are the minimum requirements that you need to get the data analytics running to solve that problem? And just starting, one at a time.
Right. That was one of my strategies too. When we sell the compliance software monitoring platform, I say, look, let me pilot it for less than 50K, sometimes, 30, 40K, to be able to analyze 100% of all your transactions. Give me 2 months. And if I can't find you a couple $100,000 or several $1 million of recoveries to make the business case, then what are we doing? And again, what's fun is that when you're analyzing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of transactions, you will find something, especially through some of the advanced algorithms that are out there today. You will. It's just the law of numbers.
And hopefully it's just internal fraud, right?
And hopefully it's not government, but being able to give that transparency, and again, bite-sized chunks. I totally agree. Let's not boil the ocean. Brew Right started with 2 countries. It wasn't 15 different ERP systems and 100 companies. Day one, it was 2 countries was what they started with. And then they expanded from there based on the success. Tom, any closing thoughts on your end?
It is not simply a must-have, it's table stakes. And if your company does not have a data analytics, or you're not moving towards data analytics, you're at risk. A regulator comes knocking and you don't have these capabilities, they're going to want to know why. And then you're going to say, well, I don't have the budget. And then they're going to say, how much did you spend last year on yellow sticky pads? $1.5 million company wide? What's more business critical? A data analytics program for compliance that protects the company, that returns money to the company, that makes you more business efficient, or $1.5 million for yellow sticky pads?
This is me dropping the mouse. Well said, Tom. Wow. Everybody, hey, we are very grateful. Thank you, everybody, for staying on. Great attendance. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email and I'll make sure I get it to Rain and Tom. My email address is vwalden@konaai.com. And again, thank you very much for your time. Great webcast, you guys. So informative. Rain and Tom, appreciate your time. And everybody, have a great rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.